Go live. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Iran War Monitor. I'm Greg Roman, Executive Director of the Middle East Forum. After 12 days of intense conflict, the guns have fallen silent. A fragile American brokered ceasefire is now in effect between Israel and Iran. After a rocky start with accusations of violations from both sides and a firm direct phone call from President Trump to Prime Minister Netanyahu, the truce appears to be holding. But let's clear what this moment represents. This is not peace. This is an Israeli and American victory. The Islamic Republic has been militarily defeated. Its nuclear program, the source of its regional aggression and global extortion, lies in ruin. Its vaunted military leadership has been systematically decapitated. Its ability to project power has been shattered, and its people have seen the emperor has no clothes. The kinetic phase of this war is over. Israel, with critical support from the United States, has achieved its primary military objectives. Now the second phase of this conflict begins, the war for a free Iran. The regime in Tehran is on life support, exposed as a hollowed out paper tiger, unable to defend its most critical assets or its most senior leaders. This is a moment of historic opportunity, not for a return to the status quo, but for the people of Iran to finish the job. The ball is now in their court, and the United States and Israel have a moral and strategic obligation to ensure they have the tools to succeed. The support must now shift from kinetic strikes to a campaign of overwhelming non-kinetic coercion. First, information warfare. The regime's first instinct was to pull the plug on the internet, plunging 80 million people into a digital darkness to hide its humiliation. The US and its allies must flood Iran with access to the free world. This means deploying satellite internet terminals like Starlink, disseminating information on built-in mesh networks, and relentlessly promoting VPNs that can bypass the state's halal net. The US must amplify the voices of dissent inside Iran and ensure every image sees the images of their leaders' failures, not the crude propaganda being broadcast on what's left of state TV. Second, psychological warfare. We must create a digital off-ramp for the thousands of wavering IRGC members and regime bureaucrats who know the ship is sinking. Israel has already begun this, making direct calls to senior Iranian officials. This must be scaled up. A massive campaign, broadcast on every available channel, should offer amnesty and a future for those who abandon the regime now. We must make it clear. There's a choice between going down with the Ayatollah or being part of a free new Iran. Third, economic strangulation. The cyber attacks on Bank Sapa and the Novitex crypto exchange were just the beginning. The U.S. Treasury must now lead a global effort to seize every dollar of the regime's ill-gotten gains stashed abroad. Any bank in any country that facilitates transactions for the IRGC or its front companies must be immediately cut off from the U.S. financial system. We must turn the regime's global financial network into a desert. The goal is simple: to create a white picket fence around Iran, isolating the regime while empowering the people. To understand how we reached this pivotal moment, it's essential to review the past 12 days of war. It began on June 12th with Operation Rising Lion. Israel, facing an existential threat from a rapidly advancing nuclear program, launched a surprise campaign. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in modern warfare. Over 200 Israeli aircraft and a series of coordinated strikes executed a decapitation strategy that stunned the world. In the opening hours, Iran's military command was eliminated. From Armed Forces Chief of Staff Mohammad Bagheri, Gholam Rashid, its head of Emergency Wartime Command, and the IRGC's intelligence chief Mohammad Kazemi and his deputy, all killed in their Tehran headquarters. Simultaneously, Israel began dismantling the pillars of Iran's nuclear program. Strikes hit the Natanz enrichment facility, showing, after an IAEA report confirmed it, that the centrifuge halls were directly impacted. The Isfahan nuclear complex was hit, and critically, strikes targeted the headquarters of the SPND, the organization responsible for weaponizing the program. The regime's response was telling. After boasting of a devastating counterattack, they managed only sporadic and increasingly weak missile barrages, most of which were intercepted. Their desperation was evident in their use of indiscriminate cluster munitions against Israeli civilians. But the turning point was this weekend, with the Fordo nuclear facility buried too deep for Israeli munitions, still a threat. The United States then intervened. American B-2 bombers dropped bunker buster bombs on Fordo and other key nuclear facilities, a move President Trump later described as a great honor to destroy all nuclear facilities and capability. This was the final blow. In a symbolic act of retaliation, Iran launched a limited missile strike against the U.S. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, an attack that caused no casualties and was clearly designed to save face before suing for peace. Hours later, President Trump announced the ceasefire. The Islamic Republic has lost. It has lost its leaders, its nuclear program, its military capacity, and its aura of invincibility, and now clings to power through information blackouts and lies. The war against the Ayatollahs is not over, however. You see, the winner on top, many have said in terms of this conflict, not including Israel, Iran, and the United States, may be the regime in Qatar. There's questions about the people's ability to rise up, and how exactly does the West take this inflection point and cause it to be for net benefit of the people of Iran and also for their strategic priorities in the region. To answer these questions, we have a panel today constituting Eric Navarro, the Middle East Forum's Director of Military and Strategic Programs, Michael Rubin, Middle East Forum's Director of Policy Analysis, and Jim Hansen, responsible for the Middle East Forum's Washington programs and its Chief Strategist. Michael, Eric, Jim, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Michael, I'd like to start with you, asking one question. The ceasefire was announced. There was a little bit of imbroglio between Bibi and Trump. But where does the U.S. and Israel go now in terms of being able to deal with Iran?
Well, Donald Trump has said very clearly that Iran must surrender its nuclear program. There's precedence for this before. In 1991, apartheid South Africa surrendered its nuclear program, and in 2003, Muammar Gaddafi surrendered his weapons of mass destruction program. In the Libya case, American and British engineers, let's call them, went in to physically dismantle the plants, lest Gaddafi change his mind. The question now is, does Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, understand he's not playing footsie with anyone who is like any of the presidents or secretaries of state before, who might allow themselves to get bogged down in process or not see the forest through the trees? Or does he understand that President Donald Trump is serious? He needs to take the diplomatic off-ramp, but he needs to actually get off. So that's what we're going to see. And Donald Trump has said that if Khamenei doesn't take his offer to resolve this issue diplomatically, the United States could be back involved militarily in Iran until the supreme leader understands he has no other choice.
Well, speaking about the supreme leader, there's reports that he has not been reachable by the top echelons of Iranian command. What exactly is his status right now, to the best of our knowledge?
Well, I recall that a couple years ago when I went to Beirut, people were mocking the late Hassan Nasrallah as the fifth Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle because all the Lebanese suspected that he spent his days in the sewers of Beirut. And perhaps Khamenei is supplanting Nasrallah now as the fifth Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, but longer Khamenei remains absent, the more his reputation, even among his hardline supporters, is going to erode.
So besides Khamenei taking the role of master splinter, I think that we have to look in terms of being able to see what his role is in all of this. There's reports of Iranians who have left Iran. They've now made it across the border to Armenia, to Iraq, to Pakistan, to Azerbaijan. And they're saying on some reports, if we go by what the BBC published last night, that there is a field which is ripe for revolution in Iran now, considering the country's failings in being able to defend its nuclear and ballistic missile program. Is that what you're hearing as well?
That is what I'm hearing. But here the long shadow of past American policy looms large. On February 15th, 1991, President George H.W. Bush at a campaign stop in Ohio said, "I call upon the Iraqi people to rise up and throw off the dictator Saddam Hussein." But then George H.W. Bush took Colin Powell's counsel and basically decided not only to stand down, but to release the Republican Guard POWs. and they immediately set forth in attacking the Iraqis who had risen up in the south and across the north of the country. This is a lesson the Iranians remember. They want to make sure that they're not going to stick their necks out only to be chopped off. Ultimately, Iran is a country that is a tinderbox. The question right now is whether the regime is better at smothering the sparks than the Iranian people themselves are at fanning the flames.
Michael, I'd like you to put yourself in the shoes of a leader of an Iranian opposition group in the diaspora. You find yourself having the first time that the U.S. has directly struck the Iranians since Operation Praying Mantis, unless we count the attack on Qasem Soleimani, but within its borders. The people in Iran are fed up with the regime. What advice would you give to this opposition leader, or what actions would you take if you were to put yourself in their shoes in terms of pushing the regime off the cliff?
Well, first of all, I would question openly and frequently, why is it that despite this 12-day Israeli bombing campaign and American bombing campaign, more Iranians were killed in repression when the Iranian regime was putting down the protests in 2019 and then with the Woman Life Freedom Movement in 2022 and 2023 than when the Israelis and the Americans bombed the country? What does that say about who respects the Iranian people more? I would openly challenge the Europeans, and for that matter, the American AFL-CIO. Why do you support organized labor everywhere in the world except in Iran? Don't you remember the lessons of solidarity in Poland in 1981 with Lech Walesa? Don't you recall how that set Eastern Europe down the cascade that ultimately brought down the Soviet Union? Or ask the European Greens, why are you fist bumping Iranian ambassadors who are complicit in massacres? Why aren't you actually supporting the environmentalists inside Iran? And at the same time, I would be doing everything possible to both lobby the outside world and to penetrate inside of Iran to restore communication, even if it's not through government checkpoints. Now, not to be too much of a nerd, Greg, but back in, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the history of the telegraph in Iran. And the telegraph was important for the mass movement. Ultimately, the government at first thought it could monopolize telegraphy, but then the opposition was able to channel it, and you had the constitutional revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini was able to get around the Shah's censorship in the 1970s, very low tech, using audio cassettes which were passed around. The question right now is, the Iranian regime thinks that it can control the internet. We've got to show them that they can't.
Thank you, Michael Rubin, Director of Policy Analysis. We're going to keep you on the panel as we get with our other guests. I'd like to bring on Marjan Greenblatt, the director and founder of ARAM, the Alliance for the Rights of All Minorities. And Marjan, that's the organization I knew you with back in about 5 years ago. I'm sure maybe there's another iteration of that, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But you have been following this not just as an American, observing what's been going on from here in the United States, but also as someone who was born in Iran, who left the country in her teens, who may still have family and friends there. What are you hearing from Iranians now that the ceasefire has been put in place in terms of what their hopes are for as it relates to the next steps within the country against the government?
Thank you, Greg. Thanks to MEF for this invitation and the opportunity to weigh in on this important conversation. And you're right, Greg. This is hitting me on a very personal level, and it's harking back memories of the times we were experiencing the Iran-Iraq war. I was a middle school student at the time when that war was in full blown, and living in Tehran. And the war escalated, and in addition to the bombings on the borders of Iran and Iraq in Ahvaz and that region, actually the Iraqis moved inside the country, and they were bombing Tehran, where I was born and where I was living at the time. And we did not have shelters. We did not know how to find safety. So our only option was to go to a basement that was ironically surrounded by glass. And we really were completely lost and confused at the time. And ironically, 30 some years later, this war has happened finally to the kinetic level, a war that Iran, the Islamic Republic, has been waging on Israel, on the US for decades, educating its generations across the board to fight for and to hate Israel and hate the United States and chant death to America and death Israel every day. And finally, the opportunity for a kinetic encounter has found its way. And still, the poor people of Iran did not have shelters, did not have a way to be safe from the bombings, that, by the way, which did not target them whatsoever. But in addition, the Iranian people were left without the ability to communicate with one another, without a siren. You would think that after 40 years of chanting death to Israel, the Iranian government would establish some kind of a buffer, some kind of a protection for its citizens should things escalate to that level. But no, the reality is that Islamic Republic's strategy in this war has always been one of offense. It was never about defending and protecting its own civilians. And this has been the pattern across the board with every other policy, domestic or international, that the Islamic Republic has adopted since its inception. It has always been about acquiring objectives abroad and never about advancing the people inside. And what is the reaction right now? I tell you, we in the opposition world and watching the Iran activists and communicating with them, there's a tremendous sense of confusion by this abrupt sense of this resolution of the war. There is no sentiment among the Iranian people that, yay, we have peace and our animosity is gone. On the contrary, there is a buildup and anticipation for something more aggressive, something more dangerous to happen. One of the predominant concerns that is expressed in the human rights community is that because the Islamic Republic regime has been humiliated by being infiltrated by Mossad, bombed by Israel, and bombed by the US, and all of its limbs decimated through the Israeli operations on its proxies, there is this new fear that this emasculated, decapitated government is going to take revenge on its civilians for the failure to at both defense and offense, and to save face. The only frontier that is left for them where they could potentially win the battle is the frontier of the domestic affairs, and that is one frontier that they win by execution, arrest, and repression of the masses. So whatever violation of human rights we have seen up to this point, I am concerned that we are going to see an escalated level of human rights violations that we have not seen before, and that as a result of this suppression of communication and lack of access to the internet, I'm concerned deeply that we are not even going to be able to get proper information about where things are going, and we can talk about it a little bit more.
So looking at that, President Trump has sent mixed signals about regime change, stating that he doesn't want it, while also posting MIGA, Make Iran Great Again. What specific policy tools should his administration employ to maintain maximum pressure while also keeping military options available?
Despite the confusion and this abrupt declaration of peace and, mission accomplished message, I think the Iranian people, by and large, trust President Trump and trust Prime Minister Netanyahu a lot more than they trust their own government. And they are hoping that they will have the right instincts and do the right thing in the end. But if I were to recommend some policy modifications or slight adjustments to what is happening right now, I would recommend that President Trump would adopt some of the messaging tools that he had in his first administration, where he spoke directly to the Iranian people in Persian. He had some of the most viewed tweets in the history of the platform, because he was directly communicating with the people of Iran, and they were thirsty and hungry for this kind of direct attention, which they were not receiving with prior administrations. So the President Trump communicated directly in Persian with the people of Iran, and that was very empowering. And that is something that is lacking right now. So when President Trump talks about, I want Iran to reach its majesty and its greatness, we don't know if he's talking to the government or if he's talking to the people. And I think he needs to come out and have a clear distinction. And there has been, and what does this peace mean? Is peace only between the countries, or also does he mean peace inside the country? Yes, there is some rethinking in the State Department about what human rights mean. But does he really not care about human life? We believe he does. And we want him to clarify this message about human life more and talk more about maximum support for the people of Iran. Should tomorrow they take to the streets and take matters to their own hands in a way that, truth be said, we can't ask Israel to come and do regime change for the people of Iran. Neither can the Americans deliver a new government to the people of Iran. They have to do that themselves. But when they go to the streets, once the bombings have stopped and they go to the streets, please make sure that the safety and security of protesters would be granted to them, and that if one life is endangered or one arrest is made because they have been protesting, let's provide maximum support to the people of Iran and protect them and stand up for them and defend their rights for self-determination.
So
and
let's
the government.
Let's unpack that for a second. What specific measures can the U.S., Israel, the West use to support not just the people on the street, but the internal opposition movements in the country, without triggering a rally around the flag effect that may inadvertently strengthen the regime?
Well, everybody was afraid that if there was kinetic action, they would be rallying around the flag. But the only rallying we saw was the usual crowd of the pro-regime supporters that get bused to go and vote for this or that candidate were also put in front of the television to show that they're upset. I'm not dismissing the pain and hardship that war can present, but I am not convinced that if people of Iran were given maximum support to go and ask for a truly democratic system that will represent them, I don't think that there would be a rallying. So let me just eliminate that fear. That aside, what are some of the specific tactical things that could happen? I think this administration could benefit from meeting with some of the key activists or leaders of the opposition movement here in the U.S. In France, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi had a very successful press conference where he talked a lot about some of these transition steps. And nobody especially him, he's the first person to tell you that he does not want to control the reins the day after the transition. Nonetheless, he is one person who can act as the transitional leader and communicator, because truth be said, yes, there are a lot of amazing heroic figures that we have in the Iranian community, but he is the single person with the broadest audience, where even people who do not want him to become a future leader of the country, they believe in his leadership right now, and he is the best representative that we have outside of Iran. Inside Iran, there we can talk about future of leadership in a moment, but here he needs to have a conversation with the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. He needs to communicate with the people of Iran that he will support them if they want to take to the streets and advocate for a free and democratic government, a representative government. and that if they were to, and maybe if they want to, it would be amazing if there could be support for the Iranians who are risking it all to strike, to write, um, and by risking it all, I mean that they lose their livelihood when they get arrested, and the families are left completely in disarray. So they need financial support so that they can participate in this kind of civic engagement opportunities. And so these are three ideas. Meet with the opposition representative, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, send a direct message to the Iranian people, and number three, provide maximum support and financial support for Iranians who are risking it all, including their livelihood and their safety, to rise up in opposition.
Marjan Greenblatt, thank you. I hope you'll stay with us for our panel later on to answer audience questions. Now we're going to go to Jim Hansen, the MEF's chief strategist and director of our Washington operations. And Jim, I know you've been following very closely the statements made this morning after President Trump came out on Truth Social and essentially ordered not U.S., but ordered Israeli jets, ordered the Prime Minister of Israel to send those jets, which were on their way to strike targets in Iran after Iran violated the ceasefire, to go back and have what he called a plane wave to Iran, and then to land back at Israeli air bases. We saw there was a radar installation struck in Tehran, but that was the only thing that Israel did, and then that was followed by another Iranian missile strike, or maybe the Iranian missiles were before the radar installation. But with this heat between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump, what does that mean for the U.S.-Israel relationship?
I don't think it has any long-term effects for the U.S.-Israel relationship. President Trump wants peace. He wants to make a deal right now. He doesn't want any more fighting. He said, we've done enough. You know, the U.S. jumped in. We flattened what we flattened. And now we're going to make a deal. And the thing that's concerning and should be at least on everyone's radar is that deal is going to be with the existing Iranian regime. He is bound and determined in the short term to go ahead and get as much of an agreement that stops them from any ability to continue their nuclear program. And as you mentioned in the monologue, someone has to go to those sites and inspect them to the extent that that's possible and find out what remains and what can be done with the wreckage and whatever is remaining. So all of those things are on his front burner. And anything that distracts from that, he's going to be very brusque and difficult about until he gets that deal. That doesn't mean long term he doesn't believe that the Iranian people deserve better government. But he said, and I think he's got a good point here, regime change would create chaos right now, and we need to clean up the rest of this stuff and get to a more stable environment before anybody talks about that. And right now, the only people who can operate the regime are the regime.
Now, when you were the president of the Security Studies Group back during the first Trump administration, you dealt a lot with the Abraham Accords. Mm-hmm. And I know that you were working very closely with those who were trying to get that deal put in place, both prior and then after its implementation, after signing to implement it. It seems to me that there may be another opportunity for a second round of this, considering President Trump's visit to the Gulf in the weeks prior to the beginning of the 12-day war. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states were notably quiet during the conflict. Does Iran's military humiliation create an opportunity for a broader regional security architecture that permanently isolates Tehran? And if so, what specific diplomatic initiatives should the Trump administration pursue with Arab partners?
I think you're absolutely right. His first overseas trip was purposely to the three most important Gulf Arab states, the Saudis, UAE, and Qatar. And he told them, I want some things from you. I'm going to give you some things. They all got some good stuff, and there were deals made, and there were military agreements and things like that. But one of the things that was discussed is, I want you to back my play against Iran, and I want your promise that at least some sort of talks towards normalization with Israel for Qatar and the Saudis who have not done so are part of this whole package. So I think there is a grand strategy of sorts in play here. It involves using the Gulf Arabs plus Israel as a stable partner for the United States, making whatever deal he needs to with the current Iranian regime to control the spread of whatever's left of their nuclear program and to get that into some sort of stability. And then to create, as you mentioned, the potential for, and if it's initially to freeze out Iran and move them towards a better government, great. In the end, that has to be a choice of the Iranian people. And I think in the course of that, President Trump should do something that signals that without pushing for regime change. And I think he should call for elections once there is a deal with the existing regime, call for free elections monitored by the international community.
Now, in terms of information operations and cyber strategy, you've advised on this topic for the past 15 years, different government bodies and other nonprofits. We saw that Israel's cyber operations successfully disabled Iranian air defenses before physical strikes. Moving forward, what information warfare campaigns could exploit the regime's demonstrated weakness to encourage defections within the security apparatus and perhaps embolden civil society?
I think Marja was actually absolutely right. I think President Trump should speak to the Iranian people, not just to his regime negotiating partners. He's going to do what he does to make a deal with them, but he needs to tell the people of Iran that he thinks they deserve better. He laid regime change on the table at one point. What he needs to say right now is, I think that the current government doesn't serve you well. I think that you can do better than that. And we're going to help you economically, diplomatically. We're going to bring you back into the community of nations where you've been isolated from just due to the revolutionary nature of the Islamic Republic that has been devastating to the well-being of the populace in Iran. So I think he should make some sort of outreach to the people directly and tell them that they are on his radar. He's not a fan of the current regime. He's doing what he needs to do to make sure this doesn't get worse.
Given what we've discussed so far, you're in the White House, you're acting as a strategist for President Trump, you have a 30-day window to look at. What is the single most important action the United States should take in the next 30 days to capitalize on Iran's current weakness and prevent any recovery of its nuclear program or regional influence?
Somebody has to get on the ground in Iran. And all of the international agencies that generally do that are compromised. The IAEA, as a UN organ, has shown all along it's not trustworthy. It's probably going to have to be the EU, or Michael Rubin has suggested India. I think any of those would be fine, but somebody has to get the ground truth, because right now we're playing rumant. CNN's reporting, oh, nothing was actually destroyed. This is all just Trump talking, and they're trying to stir the pot. All of that is counterproductive right now. Essentially, Iran's nuclear program is dead in the water, regardless of what pieces of it might still exist. So we need to go ahead and corral those existing pieces and get an agreement with the Iranian regime that they're not going to do that. They're going to leave that in the control of whatever international body is decided to do that. And once that happens, they're a neutered animal. They are no longer a danger to the rest of the world, because the rest of their military capabilities are a joke.
Well, let's talk about their military capabilities and bring on Eric Navarro, MEF's Director of Military and Strategic Initiatives. Give us a post-action report on what has exactly happened in Iran. Eric, given that the U.S. and Israeli strikes have destroyed significant portions of Iran's nuclear infrastructure and eliminated much of its top military leadership, how should we be assessing whether this represents a temporary setback or perhaps a permanent degradation of Iran's capabilities? And more specifically, what indicators should we monitor to determine if Iran attempts to reconstitute its nuclear program?
Well, I think we have to take time. Similar to what Jim said, we need ground truth. So we have a lot of different assets. I've previously mentioned space-based assets, geospatial intelligence. We have other assets. I'm sure the intelligence agencies have people on the ground. We have to get ground truth about what actually was destroyed. I do think the military capabilities of Iran were shown to be weak to begin with, and now have been severely degraded by the Israeli operations. So separate from the nuclear weapons program, I think that their military capabilities, especially their ability to protect their own skies, has been decimated. It's fascinating to me that the Israelis were able to, within a week, gain complete air supremacy. That sends a message, or should send a message to the regime, that the Israelis, with the US help, could do that at any point in the future. As far as whether they're reconstituting or not, that's where intelligence comes in. You have to monitor their movements. You have to monitor if they build new facilities, if they shift forces in different ways. But I will say, my personal opinion is they're too focused right now internally on keeping their population from rising up against them, that they're too distracted to even consider those kind of steps right now.
Intelligence assessments that are being reported suggest that the strikes set Iran's nuclear program, back by several years, rather than eliminating it entirely. What specific technical capabilities has Iran lost, and what would be the earliest realistic timeline for reconstitution if the regime survives?
Well, one, I would dispute those reports just because they're all OSINT. They're all being reported on social media. You saw some of those videos detailing the 16 cargo trucks leaving Fordo before the strike. Why is that? You got to ask yourself, why was that video released? Who made it? What do they gain from that kind of report? So I would caution everybody to question everything they see right now. And again, do that extended intelligence gathering over a period of time to understand exactly what was damaged. Now, I'll put my pundit hat on and speculate. Even regardless of the state of the uranium, it was the facilities and the ability to weaponize that uranium and put it on a weapon that could be a delivery device that I believe was destroyed. We mentioned earlier on some other live streams, it took, I think, 6 or 7 years for them to build the complex in Fordo. So they would have to find a new location and start from scratch at a minimum, which will be 5 to 10 years. But then on top of that, all of their other infrastructure is being degraded. And there's the threat hanging over them of further degradation if they attack again, if they launch any more missiles. So the question is, will they even spend any time rebuilding? That you have to watch that very closely. I think the way to do this and the way to maximize the effect of these strikes is to maintain a offensive posture for the Israelis and the U.S. And so we talked earlier, no, your other guests were talking about the non-kinetic fires. That is incredibly important here. We are not in a kinetic phase anymore. That doesn't mean we're not launching salvos at the regime, right? That's what President Trump is an expert at. Non-kinetic fires. Instead of using bullets made of metal, he's using it full of information with a purpose, with a designed target, trying to get at a desired effect. That's, I believe, what he does on social media to great effect. And I think that's what he's doing right now in real time with the ceasefire, but then with a diplomatic push after that, coinciding with the previous meetings with Gulf allies and Saudi Arabia prior to this. You brought up the Abraham Accords, that again, diplomatic fires, right? All the instruments of power now come forward besides just the military. And I expect to see that in the coming days.
Eric, before we go to a report on the ground from Alex Selsky, MEF's Israel director, I want to ask you about the implications for Iran's proxy network. With Hezbollah notably absent from this conflict, and now it looks like Iranian forces being stretched thin, how has the regional proxy network been affected by this? And more than that, should Israel and the United States move immediately to degrade these proxies while Iran is weakened, or would that risk expanding the conflict?
Well, I'll go one further. I think that President Trump and the Israelis, in negotiations with the regime, should push for ceasing Iran's support of the proxies. I never understood the delinkage, the separation of the nuclear weapons program from their support for the proxies. All they still were being aggressive and sowing regional chaos. They were just using different weapons. It's still the same thing. They are a adversary in the region, they must be defanged, right? So now the nuclear weapons program has been destroyed or degraded. Their proxy network has to be destroyed and degraded. Now, Israel, prior to this open conflict with Iran, did that with Hezbollah and Hamas. That's why you didn't see significant responses from them, even while they were in open conflict. The only ones that are still relatively intact are the Houthis. But even there, they said they would support and coordinate with Iran in response to the Israeli attacks, but I didn't see any real attacks or any missile launches there. So I would say the U.S. and Israel has achieved a significant victory here, strategic and regional, and they need to press forward. They need to. The battlefield presents opportunities to gain the advantage even further, and the proxy network is exactly where I would press forward.
Eric Navarro, thank you. Alex Selsky, reporting from Jerusalem. You have been serving as a spokesperson for IDF's Home Front Command, giving instructions on how to protect Israelis from incoming missile fire, giving an assessment of the battle damage to the public, and allowing individuals to really give hope for being able to protect themselves during this conflict. Now that the salvos have stopped launching rockets from Iran, IDF jets are back in their hangars. What's the mood like in Jerusalem?
Well, I think it's split. From one hand, people are very happy to get back to life and to send their children to kindergarten, to schools, and breathe a little. But on the other hand, I think that majority feel kind of disappointment because we cannot trust this regime. If it survives, if the nuclear program, let's assume for a moment that it's destroyed fully, how can we know that in 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, this same regime will not have the ability to renew it? And I don't think that we can get an agreement that we can trust. So I think that many people really hoped that President Trump will go until the end for regime change. And we saw that Russia will do nothing. And we saw that China, I think if they get their oil, will do nothing. They need their oil, they don't need this regime. So I think that the world now has to understand the opportunity. And the world, I mean, Americans, Europeans can be brought in, Germans definitely, the Arabs definitely, together with Israel to, roll up our sleeves, not to be afraid of this move, to prepare leadership, to prepare the support from the people bottom up in Iran, and go for it, because otherwise in 10 years max, we will get the same and even maybe more motivated and capable regime, and we cannot afford it. We are at the point where we can do it, and we must do it, I think. And I feel that this is the feeling of many Israelis, that we cannot miss this opportunity.
Alex, looking towards the feelings of Israelis beyond what they think about the results of this, what has been the actual impact on Israeli civilian infrastructure and daily life? And how quickly are damaged areas being rebuilt? I saw demolition efforts in Rishon LeZion and Tel Aviv reported earlier today. And what does this tell us about Israel's resilience and preparedness for potential future exchanges of fire between the two countries?
Well, I'll give you a general picture. I will not go into details. I can just tell you that, no strategic site was damaged except the stopping of the work of the oil refinery in Haifa, but it was not really damaged, so it will be, revived very, very fast. More than 90% of the rockets were stopped. We do have a few tens of people killed, and everyone for us is the whole world. We have, tens of buildings that we have to rebuild, but really the damage is not so high. And the resilience is amazing. You can see people that lost their homes, and they say to the TV, they say, but the price worth it. So just go until the end. We in the Middle East Forum and the Israel Victory Project, I want to remind, we made a policy paper where we examined the ability of the Israeli society to pay the price to lose lives, and we discovered that the price, uh, Israeli society can pay the price if they know that there is victory. So I think that Israelis can go more further if they know that we can really put the end to this threat. I don't think that Israelis at this moment feel that it's done.
Based on everything you're seeing and hearing on the ground, what's the prevailing view among Israeli security professionals about whether this military victory can be translated into lasting strategic change in the region? Do they believe Iran's regime has been fatally weakened? Or are they preparing for a long twilight battle ahead?
It's a very good question. I don't know, by the way, that we really can examine this. Eric said very correct thing. We just don't know. We see these reports of the American intelligence that the nuclear program was degraded and not and even not degraded so much, but nobody really knows. We have first of all to go to to really check and really examine what happened, what was the damage, and then to see what we have to must do next. I think that many people just really are not sure because we hear different voices. We hear some voice from Israel that everything is destroyed, and we hear other voices from the American intelligence. So first of all, I think we really have to analyze, and if it's not done, somehow to to push further with diplomatic international effort. I don't think that we will be able now to do some other military steps, but I hope to think that Israeli government understand that if it's needed, we can resume it too.
I want to bring Michael Rubin back on because, Michael, you've done a very good job of commissioning dozens of pieces, looking at all the very intricate viewpoints on this subject. And also, I think more specifically, being able to look at what the next steps for strategy might be. Looking beyond the immediate ceasefire, what are the most likely scenarios for Iran over the next 12 to 18 months? Should U.S. and Israeli planning assume regime survival with diminished capabilities or internal collapse, or maybe a desperate attempt at escalation?
Well, first of all, let's remember that the choice for regime change is ultimately not going to be made in Washington or Jerusalem. It's going to come from Iran. And when it comes to the survival of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, let's also remember he's 86 years old, he's previously had cancer, and he's partially paralyzed. I don't know about you, but I'm not going to bet too much on his longevity in such a situation. So Iran is heading towards regime change, whether anyone wants it or not. It behooves us, therefore, to sort of plan and figure out how we can put our thumbs on the scale so that we can get the best possible outcome for the Iranians, for our own national security, and for peace in the region. One of the things that frustrates me as a historian, having lived through this in Iraq and studied it in other cases, Americans can be very well-meaning. We're talking about an even playing field, but and that becomes our excuse for really doing very little. But if we're the only ones who care about an even playing field, and everyone else has their thumbs on the scale, then ultimately what that means is the most liberal, the most pro-Western segments of society are at the biggest disadvantage. Now, to answer your question, when it comes to Iran, the key issue is the disposition of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. We talk about hardliners versus reformers in politics. We don't have as good insight into hardliners and reformers and the factional divisions within the Revolutionary Guard. In 2007, Muhammad Ali Jafari, who was then head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, determined that the biggest threats to Iran were actually going to be internal. And so he created a new structure with a Revolutionary Guard unit in every province. One of the things we don't know is whether those Revolutionary Guard units are native to the provinces in which they serve, whether the people staffing them, that is, because that gives an indication whether ideology trumps kinship if given the order to fire in the streets. The other thing which we need to be looking for, and which we also at the same time need to prevent if we detect it, is the movement of the remnants of Hezbollah from Lebanon into Iran to do crowd control. Traditionally, when the Islamic Republic is afraid of its own people, it embraces outsiders to do the dirty work who have no compunction on firing in the crowds in the streets. How are we going to protect the Iranian people from that, or at least prevent that scenario from unfolding?
Michael, thank you. Now we're going to go to our full panel and try to answer some audience questions. First, we're going to start off with Carrie, who asks, does the Crown Prince have any support outside of the Los Angeles Iranian expat community? I turn this one to Marjan.
I actually responded to this question on the chat, and the answer is yes. The reality is that the Crown Prince is extremely popular among the Iranian population inside Iran and in the diaspora. He has been communicating with the people of Iran and the expats for decades. And he has not really put himself forward as the spokesperson for ever. And right now he is doing this because he is seeing for the once in a historical opportunity to put his leadership really as a service to the society. And I also wanted to mention that one of the reasons, in my opinion, why a lot of English-speaking Western audiences do not know about him or do not want to, or are skeptical about a prince or a former monarch, is their own bias, their own historical background, and the skepticism about monarchy and wealth and capitalism, and those are the vestiges of left-wing ideology that are finding their way in the mainstream conversation. And you don't recognize that Iran has had a long history of monarchy, and for the Iranians, monarchy is not a bad idea. So that's one thing. And if there is an opportunity, I would like to talk about the election concept that Jim Hansen mentioned. But
yeah, Marjan, we can maybe get to that, but we want to try to get through some of these other questions. I noticed the dialogue, but my ability to process information and host at the same time is limited. But I'll definitely work on that for the next one. David asks, and I think Marjan, you had a dialogue about this, but we want all of our channels to be able to see the answer. Even prior to the recent conflict, Iranian exile groups often seemed most intent on criticizing and demeaning one another, so much that an outsider it is difficult to gauge who the U.S. can effectively work with. Can you provide some general overview of who the major groups are, what we know about each in terms of its worldview and potential as a partner in helping the Iranian people secure their freedom? I'm going to go to Michael on this one.
Okay. Well, I agree with Marjan that the former Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, has a great deal of support. I would double down on both inside Iran and outside Iran. Part of his support inside Iran is because of the notion the grass is always greener. The monarchy is remembered rather fondly. He does have a little bit more support within the conservative Bazardi class and among older generations. It's an open question how much of that support translates to the younger generation that never experienced the period before the Islamic Revolution. The main other external group is something called the Mujahideen al-Haq. They actually fought with Ayatollah Khomeini to create the Islamic Revolution, and then he purged them. They immediately turned towards Saddam Hussein and used Saddam Hussein and their alliance with him to try to get revenge on the Islamic Republic. Most Iranians, quite honestly, despise the Mujahideen al-Haq. There's absolutely no indication they have any support inside Iran. Most Iranians see them as treasonous. Their greatest support seems to be among American or former European politicians to whom they pay exorbitant honoraria. Then you have various ethnic groups, especially in the Kurdish area, to a lesser degree in the Baluch area, that are legacies of past times, the Komala, the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, and so forth. Many of these groups lack unity. And remember, when it comes to ethnic groups, Iran has a sense of nationhood that actually extends back centuries before this concept of ethnic nationalism as the core of a country came into being. And so you don't necessarily, we can't project our view of these ethnic groups on them. Then there's some liberals, there's some Republicans, but basically a lot of the other external groups are 40 guys with a newspaper, 35 of whom think they're generals, and the other 5 who accept their privates.
There's a conversation that took place in the chat between David and Donald and Eric. And Eric, I don't know if that's you or Eric or another Eric who's watching, but the question is by Donald. Eric, giddiness is not helpful, but what in the world do you mean by unintended consequences? Are you also afraid of the chaos of regime change? So maybe what I'll ask is, if we do provide some non-kinetic support and it ends up causing civil disturbances in Iran, what if we do go by the law of unintended consequences and that goes into full Iranian civil war? How does the West deal with that? I'm going to ask Eric Navarro first and then Jim to respond.
The way to deal with it is to ensure that you have guardrails to make sure that it doesn't extend or spill out into neighboring countries, and then internally that you're backing the right horse. We talked in previous live streams about this, where you could leverage the regular army to potentially keep order in such a situation and eliminate or focus on the IRGC. And then to the point mentioned earlier today in this broadcast about which opposition party to focus on, which opposition party to work with, you got to get it right. Is there risk in all of this? Of course. But you got to mitigate those risks as best as possible. You have to stake out the objectives, and then you have to be ruthless about trying to achieve those objectives.
Jim, how would the White House deal with the potential spiraling of the events in Iran?
I think that's a likely scenario, and the preparations are underway for some sort of succession planning landing pads, I guess you could call them. And I don't believe they're going to pick winners to start with, because the worst case scenario is this looks like any kind of U.S. deciding who is going to be the next rulers of Iran. So they're going to be very circumspect in backing anyone. And I think back to the idea that the best thing that President Trump can do is say the people of Iran deserve better government. And right now they're not getting what they deserve, and we want to help them achieve that goal, but that has to come from within. And then as it plays out, if there are civil disturbances and strikes and other forms of soft protest, those can be used to see who has the actual voice of the Iranian people. And at that point, the decision has to be made. Are there covert means to support that? And at what point does President Trump come out and say, these are the ones we think should be the next rulers of Iran?
Michael Rubin, Jim Hansen, Marjan Kipor Greenblatt, Alex Selsky, and Eric Navarro, thank you for joining us for this summation of the 12-day war. Some final thoughts. For 12 days, the world watched as missiles and jets redrew the map of power in the Middle East. But what we witnessed was more than a conflict. It was the shattering of an illusion. The myth of the Islamic Republic's strength, cultivated for over 4 decades, has collapsed under the weight of Operation Rising Lion. This evening, we've seen the comprehensive battle damage assessment. We've gone over all of the points of what happened after this war has now ended, and the conclusion is undeniable. There was a systemic failure of the Iranian regime on every conceivable front. Its military leadership was surgically dismantled. The IRGC's most senior commanders, men who had been the architects of terror for a generation, were eliminated in their homes and headquarters. Their replacements were eliminated just as quickly. Its nuclear ambition, the source of its global blackmail, was crippled. From the enrichment halls of Natanz, now confirmed by the IAEA to be directly damaged, even deep underground, to the very workshops that built the centrifuges, the program has been set back by years, if not permanently. And its conventional forces were blunted. Its missile sites were cratered, and its air defenses were blinded, rendering its retaliation sporadic and ineffective. But the most profound damage was not to concrete and steel, but to the regime's psychological hold on its own people. When the state can no longer protect its capital, its people voted with their feet. We saw the images, the endlessness of the lines of taillights fleeing Tehran in the dead of night. The mother and child, armed only with pillows, seeking refuge in a subway tunnel because their government had provided no other shelter. The skeletal remains of buildings that once stood as symbols of the regime's power. In the face of this collapse, the regime's only response was to turn off the internet for its own people, imposing a near total internet blackout to hide its humiliation. But the truth still echoed in the streets and from the towers and rooftops with chants of death to the dictator. The war fought by missiles and jets may be over, but the war for Iran's future has just begun. The illusion of the regime's power is gone, and what is left is a terrified leadership and an emboldened people. The world is now watching to see what they do next. I'm Greg Roman. Thank you for joining us.